This is Camp Countdown, a Toronto Maple Leafs podcast series. I'm your host, Kyle Cushman, and on today's show, we're diving into the game of Ryan Tverberg, one of my favorite prospects for a few years now in the Leafs system. Drafted in the 7th round, 213th overall in 2020, Tverberg is already one of the best stories in the Maple Leafs organization. He was drafted out of the OJHL with the Toronto Junior Canadiens after scoring 26 goals and 51 points in 47 games back in 2019-20. He's a really unique case of a guy being drafted out of the OJ, but also somebody that the Leafs traded into that slot to draft. It's not something that you really see ever, teams moving into the 7th round to take an extra player, especially when the Leafs in that 2020 draft had already drafted a bunch of players. Looking at that 2020 draft for the Leafs, they had already drafted 11 players in that draft before trading into that slot to draft Ryan Tverberg. In fact, they had already drafted 2 players previously in the 7th round before taking him. It's a very unique case where they traded a 2021 7th round pick to move into the end of that draft with the Bruins to take Tverberg. And it's a good thing they did, because looking at all of those kind of late round picks that the Leafs had in that 2020 draft, Tverberg by far looks like the best one. Wyatt Shingothi hasn't even been at Leafs development camps the past couple of years. He's very much out of the NHL picture. John Fusco is a long shot. You can listen to my episode on him. He has one more year in the NCAA, very much a long shot player. Joe Miller, another long shot, smaller type player. Axel Rindell out of the Leafs organization, Vidi Miettinen out of the Leafs organization, Dmitry Ovchynnikov out of the Leafs organization. So out of those players drafted in the 5th round or later in 2020, Ryan Tverberg is essentially the only one still in a big role in the Leafs organization, and in fact, kind of knocking on the door of the NHL in certain aspects. And he's the one that was barely even included in the draft because they had to trade into that slot at the end of the 7th round in 2020 to even get him into the system. He was originally committed to go to Harvard in 2020, but with their year being canceled, he opted to switch his commitment to the University of Connecticut. He joined the team in the winter semester, joining the team in the back half of the year, and he put up 7 points in 14 games as he went from the OJHL to the NCAA in a very competitive Hockey East Conference. So it's a pretty big jump to make. But what he showed in some of those games was something that really made an intriguing impact as a prospect. Sure, he had put up some decent scoring the previous season in the OJHL, and 7 points in 14 games is decent production for a freshman jumping in the back half of a year. But what really stood out was Tverberg's work ethic and his tenacity. In that kind of bottom 6 role with UConn, he was throwing hits. He was really fast. He was an energy type player. And that 2021 season as a sophomore, he completely blows things out of the water. In the early part of the season, I was calling him your favorite Leafs prospect that you don't know about. And I think a lot of people kind of know Tverberg's name now, at least a little bit, just because he's played with the Marlies and he's done some things in the Leafs organization now, but he's definitely not a household name by any means at this point. And he's still somebody that I think is going to make a lot of fans once people kind of become more familiar with his game. But in 2021, in the early part of that season, he goes from being that kind of depth player on UConn to a legitimate top 6 producing forward. In fact, he was playing so well in the early part of that season as kind of one of the only players of note on that UConn roster. He got a call to Team Canada's camp for the World Juniors. He ultimately didn't make the roster, but as a 7th round pick the year prior, literally in October of the year prior, because it was the 2020 draft, very, very impressive for a 7th round pick out of the NCAA as well to make an impact on Hockey Canada to get that kind of call. So he has that really good sophomore season. He follows it up with another very good junior season at UConn with 15 goals, 30 points in 35 games in 22-23. And at that point, he's got 2 years under his belt with really productive NCAA seasons. there's not really a lot left for him to do at UConn just because he's kind of one of the only notable prospects at that time. Obviously, they brought in Matthew Wood, and he was somebody that was mixing in as well. But for the most part, there was no real reason for him to go back for his senior season. It was better for him to jump to the professional ranks. And that's what he ended up doing. He signed his entry-level contract at the end of the 22-23 season. He was mixing in with games at the end of the season for the Marlies as they were jostling for playoff position and whatnot, and didn't put up any points in that span and actually got hurt during that stretch and didn't finish the season. So for Tverberg coming into last year, I wasn't really sure what to make of expectations because, yeah, he had put up some decent numbers at UConn in terms of production, 32 points and 30 points and 36 and 35 games, respectively. That's good production that put him in kind of like the fringe top 10 area in terms of these prospect rankings. But it wasn't anything that made you go, oh, wow, this guy's going to be a top producer right away in the NCAA, the same way that, say, like a Nick Abruzzese was like coming out of college, where he had two insane, highly productive offensive seasons, and he kind of had the offensive skill set and the intelligence to be like a top 6 contributor right away in the AHL. I wasn't quite as sure what to make of Tverberg at basically the same age coming into the AHL. And he was fantastic in the first half. He was over a point per game, actually, in his first 20 games. He was really productive in kind of a bottom 6 role that pushed him higher in the lineup as well. And it was something where his stock was really starting to kind of spike just because of that production in the early part of the season. Now, that production was a bit inflated, I think is the easiest way to put it. He had 23 points in 21 games, but the 7 goals in that span, 4 of which came in one game. He had a 4-goal performance against Belleville in a blowout game. It was an awesome game for him. He actually scored like 3 goals like the exact same way, or at least 2 goals the exact same way. And it was something where that was like a statement game for him. But you look at that game, and yes, you need to include that obviously in his season-long performance because it's something that he legitimately did, and it's obviously a legitimate great achievement to put up a 4-goal game as an AHL rookie. But you take that performance out, and then it's 3 goals in 20 games, and still good production, but not quite as high end. And then you compare that to the second half of the season, where he only had 2 goals and 9 points in 25 games in the second half of the season. And that's more in line with kind of the expectations for what he would have been. The point per game stuff was way kind of exceeding expectations and maybe a bit more inflated just because of some on-ice percentages. The back half of the season, when he was closer to that like 25 point pace, that kind of thing, is more what I expected from Tverberg, probably just playing in like a bottom 6 role. And so just comparing the two, if the back half is kind of the expectation for what he had going into the season, and you add that first half where he exceeded the expectations, that's overall a very good season for Tverberg, which ultimately gave him 9 goals and 32 points in 46 games as an AHL rookie. Very, very good numbers for Tverberg making the jump to the AHL ranks. He mixed in a little bit at center, primarily played on the right wing, which is where I think his best position is, certainly as kind of the work ethic, tenacity, physical winger. And he mixed in with players higher in the lineup than I think a lot of people expected him to. I think a lot of people expected him to be kind of the 4th line, sometimes 3rd line guy. He ended up being pretty much a top 6 regular over much of the season. And he finished the season playing with guys like Joe Blandisi and Roni Hirvonen in a 3rd line role. The issue with Tverberg is I mentioned some of the injuries he had in 2023 when he went pro. He had some of those injury issues last season as well. You heard the 46 games. That's a lot less than what the Marlies play over the course of the season. He missed a decent chunk of the season due to injury in the first half of the season, and then he missed the end of the season due to an upper body injury sustained at the end of March. So he didn't even get into any playoff games this season. So for Tverberg, there's a lot to like about his game. The work ethic, the straight line speed, the tenacity, the playmaking is something that he showed a lot more than I expected this year. He was primarily a playmaker, which I expected him to be more of kind of a finisher, to be honest. Not that he has a long range shot, but I just figured given his straight line speed, skill set, things like that, he would be more of that kind of net front finisher, kind of drive the net and bury chances versus somebody setting up chances. So for Tverberg, I'm excited about the playmaking that he showed this past year. I think he can score more regularly if he utilizes more of that straight line speed, which he didn't do as much this year. He showed it a lot in the NCAA, where he would take defenders on one-on-one, beat them wide, drive the net, and he would also kind of throw the body around a little bit more than he did at the professional ranks. Part of that comes down to just self-confidence and getting used to the level of play. So I'm very excited to see what we can get out of Tverberg as a sophomore, coming back from injury, having the full season of AHL hockey under his belt, knowing what to expect from this level, but also knowing what to expect from himself at this level and what he can do at this level. He's 22. He's going to turn 23 in January during the season. So it's not like he's some 20-year-old that's just getting started at the professional ranks, like some of the other kind of sophomores that you would see in the AHL, guys that are like 21 years old coming out of the junior ranks. This is somebody that has a couple years under his belt in the NCAA, now has that one season in the AHL under his belt, and is 22 years old. He's 6 foot, 190 pounds. He's got a stocky frame, and it's time to kind of take another step here, kind of build on that last season, show more of what he did in the first half versus the second half, and really push into a legitimate top 6 role with the Marlies. And by the end of next season, hopefully be pushing for some NHL minutes. He's somebody that I don't think will ever be like a top 9 forward in the NHL, just kind of given some of the lack of maybe puck skills or creativity. He's much more of a straight line, hard-nosed type player. But for somebody like Tverberg, there is absolutely an appetite for those kind of players at the bottom of a lineup. Just look at the Leafs trading for somebody like Connor Dewar this year. He could absolutely fill a similar role at the NHL level if he kind of hits the heights that he potentially could, in terms of being this kind of speedy energy guy at the bottom of a lineup who could maybe chip in on a penalty kill or a power play too if you really get down to it, which probably isn't going to be the case. So as I said, Tverberg's been a guy that I've really liked, just given his unique story coming out of the OJHL, being a very late round pick that the Leafs traded into that slot to take him. He's proven them right over the past years. He's at least proven himself to be a legitimate AHLer last season, and I'm excited to see the steps that he could take this upcoming season. He's definitely still a top 12 kind of prospect in the organization, just given he's got 1 year under his belt. He showed some flashes last year in the AHL, and I'm excited to see what he can do this upcoming season. So to dive more into Tverberg's game, very excited to get to my conversation now with Steven Ellis, who has watched Tverberg play for many years now, dating back to like his AAA and OJHL days, and over the past couple of years with the Marlies as well. So let's get to that now. My conversation with Daily Faceoff's Steven Ellis. Very excited to welcome on Steven Ellis to talk all about Ryan Tverberg. Steven, thanks for taking some time today.
Yeah, no problem. It's a guy I've watched for a long time, so always like talking about him.
Yeah, you mentioned seeing him for a long time. This is a bit of a unique story in the kind of the NHL sphere, not just the Leaf sphere, as a 7th round pick out of the OJHL, the Junior Canadians program, and making an impact in the AHL already as a 22-year-old. Can you talk a little bit about kind of when you first kind of saw Tverberg and kind of the unique path he's taken the last couple of years?
Yeah, so I got to watch him a little bit at the AAA level back in, I think I want to say 2017. And,
Yeah.
he was a good player, but nothing that would make you think, oh, yeah, this guy's going to be an NHL prospect. And then I got to see him a bit when he was at the Junior Canadians, when I was still working with the Oakville Blades at the time. And I remember seeing him. He didn't really do a lot. He was an aggressive player, but didn't go out there and put up any points. And then watching him in that 2019-20 season where he had, 26 goals, over 50 points, like all of a sudden he took over on a team that, like, the thing about the OJHL is you expect the older players to take over. And I think he like at that point, he had a bit of experience playing at that level the year before, but wasn't like, OJHL in your first year of junior hockey, that's definitely a tough one in your draft year. So I think when he went out there and really impressed, played a big role in that team, and was easily one of the better goal scorers, and all of a sudden you see him drafted, and I was surprised. I know there was definitely a lot of scouts that were keeping a close eye on him, but again, nothing about like for you to get drafted out of the OJHL, right now it's not as big of a league as it used to be. There's not the amount of talent. Like I remember watching guys like Mario Ferraro, Jake Wallman play big roles. And then you look in like when I was working with the Oakville Blades, Evan Bouchard and Ryan McLeod were both there for a brief period of time. So that was good, but you don't see that talent coming these days. So for him to go out there and shine kind of near the end of, I would say, like the bigger years of the OJHL, that meant a lot for the league. And for him to go in the seventh round, at that point, you're just kind of hoping he turned into something. But I don't think anyone kind of expected him to do the numbers that he did at the University of Connecticut.
Yeah, talking about like within like a year or two of being drafted was on Hockey Canada radars, getting an invite to World Junior camps and point per game NCAA player. Like he made an impact pretty quickly after being that seventh round pick and definitely has established himself as somebody to watch in the Leafs organization. We just had his rookie season in the AHL. Can you give a bit of a brief intro to what we can expect from Tverberg when he steps on the ice, kind of what you saw from him in his rookie season in the AHL?
He was one of the most impressive players for me, and he missed some time due to injuries and stuff like that. But at one point, he was tracking it. He had a 50-point rate, and which is quite impressive for a guy who really looks kind of like a bottom six grinder. And I think the thing about him, which made him so interesting, especially to Hockey Canada, was that this guy knew he wasn't going to be like a 30, 40 goal scorer if he made the NHL. He had to find other ways to really make it work. And that's what makes a lot of prospects interesting these days, where okay, if you're not going to be a goal scorer, you're not going to be a top six player, you've got to find ways to be effective. One example is Teddy Stiga, who just got drafted by Nashville. Yeah. He's someone who just does a bit of everything out there. And I'm not saying, they're two similar players in terms of skill levels. I'd give it Stiga 100%. But when it comes to, Stiga knew, okay, I'm not going to go and put up a ton of points. Let's see what other roles I could do. But then he ended up becoming such a versatile player that he was a top player on the U.S. national development team. You look at a guy like Vasily Podkolzin, scored a lot at a young age, but he's not a well-rounded player. And we've seen kind of how his career's gone. With Tverberg here, I think what we're seeing here is someone who will grind, he'll back check hard, he'll hit. He had 18 penalty minutes this year, but I think it doesn't really show you how aggressive he actually was. He battles hard. He's really difficult to beat in front of the net. And, he's not this massive guy. He's 6 foot. I think he's over 190 pounds or close to that. But, he's not going out there crushing guys. He's just going to outwork you. And that effort is why I see him highly in the system here, because you need guys like that. You need players who are going to put that effort on the fourth line. And I think that's something where this year I expect him to put up a ton of points in the AHL. Like he should be able to break the 40-point barrier, maybe 45. But then you're kind of looking at everything else he does. It's like, oh, cool, he can put up points. But he's also going to back check like his life depends on it. And someone like that, you really want in your system.
Yeah, absolutely. He's a player that I've definitely liked his game for a while. Basically, whenever you watch him play, he's exactly what you think of when you think of like a fan favorite type player, just given that work ethic. What did you make of his rookie season? It was a bit of an up and down campaign. You mentioned some of the injury issues in the first half. It seemed like everything was going right for him. He was over a point per game in the first half with 23 points in his first 21 games. In the back half, that scoring kind of dipped more to what you would expect for an AHL rookie with 9 points in his last 25 games. So definitely a tale of two seasons there. But what did you make of his season overall, making the jump from the NCAA to the AHL last year?
It was better than I expected, to be honest. Yeah. Like he kind of said, like his numbers eventually leveled out. He wasn't going out there and putting up the point rate that he was doing, but he still, I think, had a decent end to this season where there were some ups and downs there for sure. But when you look at what he was able to do at Connecticut, 30 points in that final year, 35 games, like good numbers for a school like that where you're not going to get superstar talent. But I was thinking like we were talking about like guy getting 15, 20 points this year in the AHL and playing a much, lesser role. But I think, he got the opportunity early to kind of show what he was able to do. He got that 7-game run at the end of the previous season. So I think the coaching staff kind of had an idea of like, okay, this guy knows how hard he has to work out there. And the fact that they were continuously putting him in there in important defensive situations, I thought was good. Seeing him on power play from time to time. Now, when I go to Marlies games, I'm usually sitting at one of the photo holes. So I've kind of got like a pretty good view, I'd say, the whole game of what's going on. But the one thing was you'd see the speed and you'd see that work ethic. And even when games where he wasn't putting up points, he was finding ways to do stuff out there on the ice and hit guys and be aggressive. So I think that, again, going back to how well-rounded he is, like I think that he showed enough there that I'm excited to see what he can do this year.
Yeah, he even mixed in a little bit at center as well. You mentioned some of the versatility. He played a little bit down the middle. I still like him a lot more on the wing just to kind of be that kind of F1 work ethic, hard worker type player. I think that fits his game a bit more. But you mentioned the versatility, playing in kind of all situations and mixing in at a couple of forward positions definitely helps that as well. Uh, some of the injuries is definitely a big factor here for Twerberg. He was injured a little bit at the end of his first or his debut at the professional level with the Marlies. You mentioned that 7 game stretch, got banged up there at the end of that, battled multiple injuries this past season, only played the 46 games. The work ethic is such a big part of his game, but we've kind of seen it a little bit with other work ethic players like a Nick Robertson type, where they have to kind of figure out how to be that type of player while also staying healthy. Is that something that you see with Twerberg, or have the injuries been more fluky in your mind?
I think fluky, like he doesn't have a history of getting
Yeah.
injured a lot, and I think also compared to Robertson, he's definitely a
Yeah.
stronger physical player. I think of Robertson, I was always concerned about him there, be like watching him play, even a bit in the OJHL where it looked like he was getting pushed around way too much. We've seen that in the NHL where he struggled to stay healthy, and then obviously the Leafs have really given him ideal situations all the times to be playing in there. But when it comes to this guy here, I think I think he's just physically built stronger, and I think that will give him the advantage. And I think this year was a learning year for him, and I think he's going to be. I think he'll be okay.
So for Twerberg, we've talked a lot about the work ethic, and I think it goes back to kind of the straight line speed that we saw a lot from him in the NCAA. Worked a lot against NCAA defenders, beating them wide, driving to the net. That was how he scored a lot of kind of his highlight reel goals in the NCAA. Didn't see that quite as much last year with the Marlies. Is that something that might come with a bit more confidence? We saw a bit more of the playmaking last year with the Marlies.
Yeah, 100%. I think, last year he was kind of going out there and whoever he was playing with, he was kind of trying to utilize those guys as much as humanly possible. But, I think with him, it's like he's 22. He's technically a little older on the prospect scale, but he's not a guy that has this gifted offensive talent. So he's got to find these other ways to be effective. I think this past year we're just learning how to deal with the pace. We obviously know he can skate out there, but let's see how he can do it against older, stronger competition. He had some starts and stops. Obviously, he didn't play that full season, but I think this is something where midway through this year, I'm assuming he should be able to get it from then. Like 15 goals is probably what we're looking at here, I'd say, and that would be kind of on par of what he was able to do in college too. So that would look good. But yeah, I'm like expecting a bit of a jump there. I feel like he looked a bit more confident with the puck near the second half of this season, but wasn't going out there blowing the doors off with the goal scoring. So I guess we'll have to see, because like when you look at those numbers, like if you adjust it for a full season, we're looking at 45 points. Like that's still pretty good, and probably
Yeah.
was going to get closer to 15 goals. So I do expect that he's going to build upon that this year.
Yeah, and a lot better than definitely what I was expecting coming into the year. And I think what most people were expecting coming into the year. You mentioned it earlier, kind of that like 20-ish point projection coming into the year is like a bottom six type. And he popped some offense in some big spots when he got those opportunities. I think the obvious standout is the 4 goal game, the 5 point game against Belleville there, where he scored like the same goal like 3 different times. Definitely skews the overall goal totals a little bit over the course of the season, but that's kind of the game that can pop for Twerberg and kind of shows the offense that he can have when getting the opportunity with some guys higher in the lineup, some higher skill players.
It's funny, like 2 weeks later, I think he had a 3 point game. I want to say it was
Mm,
against Cleveland. And I remember being even more impressed with that game because that was a game that the defense and goaltending they were on strike for both teams that game. It was like 7-5 or something like that. But he went out there and had a 3 point night, and it looked really impressive. But yeah, like, goals weren't always easy to come by there. And I'd say he obviously did a lot better job of that kind of the mid portion of the season. But I think the fact that he still found ways to be effective. It's just one that scoring starts to follow. Like that's going to be a guy that's really dangerous and really difficult to beat out there. Like you look at like a guy like Alex Steves, and someone I've really wished Toronto would have given a bigger opportunity to at this point, because you see what he's able to do with the AHL. He's about to break the Marley scoring record pretty shortly at the start of the season, but he's not as well rounded here. And I think, when you look at a guy who can then also bring that scoring touch on top of the way he goes out there and back checks and brings the speed, like, yeah, there's a lot to like.
at this point of his development, what would you consider the standout trait or the biggest strength in Twerberg's game? We've talked a lot about the work ethic. That's probably where it comes back to. But is there a standout trait that is kind of his defining characteristic right now in his development?
Obviously, again, how hard he works, but I will say that I think his defensive play is pretty good too. And you see him play on the penalty kill. You'd see him go out there and blocking shots. Like he's always aware. Uh, you see him sometimes where he'll get caught on a longer shift because the Marlies are stuck in their own zone, and he doesn't seem to slow down there. He still has that athleticism out there. So he kind of combined all that, and that's a guy that's built to be in difficult situations and come out on top.
And on the flip side, what is kind of the biggest area you need to see from him to develop on, to work on, to eventually become that NHLer at the bottom of a lineup that can chip in as a water bug type hard worker that can give you some potential special teams value as well?
I think, one thing I'd like to see is he just get himself into actual better scoring positions. I think, for a guy who knows how to score, he got caught a lot behind defensemen and got kind of caught watching and not being able to go out there and beat older or stronger players out there. So I think, I want to see him add a bit more muscle there to his game because, again, we know he's strong, but he can be stronger to go out there and out muscle those guys and get into the scoring spots that he needs to be in.
And so what are your expectations for him coming into this season? You've talked about it a little bit here with kind of that 15 goal projection. He had the really good first half, not as productive second half, but still talking about 9 points in 25 games. That's kind of the pace that we expected for him coming into the year. So even the not as good back half was still about what we expected for him coming into the season. Now, after that rookie season in the AHL, some injuries derailed things a little bit. What are your expectations for him coming into his second full season with the Marlies?
It'd be interesting to see kind of who he plays with there because I think, he's got enough there to go out there and play with someone like Alex Nylander and let Nylander focus on the shooting and focus on the scoring and not as much being a two-way threat because we know that's not really his game. And you go out there and you have someone who can do that. Maybe you go say, hey, like we're going to give you a chance to go play with who's another good guy they could play with. I'd like to see what he and Ty Voigt could do because we know Voigt's got the talent.
Yeah.
Maybe see Fraser Minton. They could. I don't know if I want to say they want to be a shutdown line because that's probably what you don't want Fraser Minton doing at this level. But that's kind of what I feel like he would do in the NHL. But there's just a lot of opportunities for him to play a big role for this team. No Logan Shaw, a couple other guys have moved on, so giving him an opportunity here to go and play a pretty significant role, I think he should be a top six player.
Yeah, there's so many bodies always with the Marlies at the beginning of seasons, and it always eventually works itself out. But there's so many fascinating combinations when you look at Tverberg and potentially matching up with somebody like an Alex Steves type on the opposite wing, potentially getting some time with Jake Quillen, who's new to the organization. Like there's a lot of different duos and trios that you can make that are very exciting for Tverberg. And I think that goes back to the play style and his versatility, being able to play with so many different types of players and the work ethic that he brings being a positive attribute to so many different lines. He can play in the top six like we think he probably will at the start of the season. He can just as easily play in the bottom six, which ultimately is that NHL projection for him, being that kind of fourth line water bug type. Looking ahead now to what could be an NHL future. The last Leaf seventh rounder to make the NHL was Pierre Engvall, drafted back in 2014. So it's been a few years since the Leafs have had one of those really late round guys kind of break through to the NHL. Tverberg is definitely the one right now that seems like he has the best chance to do so. What is kind of the NHL timeline for him? He's at the 1 year with the Marlies under his belt. He'll have another year under his belt this upcoming year where he'll probably be with the Marlies the entire season. If things go right for him and the development continues on the trajectory that we've seen so far, when do you think we could see him push for NHL minutes?
I think this is a guy that's still going to be a long shot to make the NHL, unless he goes out there and finds a way to start exploding offensively and become again that that he can do everything at both ends. I think with him, it's difficult because the Leafs, it's always been talked about needing some depth in that bottom six, but there's a lot of guys who could do that, and that's the thing when you don't draft high year after year, you're going to be getting a lot of these guys who are going to be trying to fight for those positions. So I think he's got to go out there and show that he can just every single night he's got that effort, and because there were some off nights, but go out there and show that he could just be so indispensable because these are the type of players you typically will try to find on league minimum deals during the summer, right? Like a Ryan Reeves or maybe someone who's actually good at hockey, better than hockey, Ryan Reeves, which isn't hard to do, but go out there and try to find those guys who could play those types of roles. through free free agency. Hard enough for me to say. So he's already got a tough road to get there, but I think that he will play some NHL games, probably not on a full-time basis, at least for a couple of years. But maybe this next season's probably not it. Maybe 25, 26, maybe 26, 27 if they still keep him around there, because I do think he brings value.
Yeah, and you mentioned the value, the kind of prototype maybe a little bit, or the comparison that I looked to at least last year with the Leafs is like a Connor Dewar type that they brought in mid-season, somebody that kind of plug and play on the fourth line, gives you some energy in the playoffs and kind of excels in that kind of situation, can give you some penalty kill value, but ultimately isn't somebody that's going to break the bank on a contract or anything like that and be around that kind of 1 million to league minimum mark. If Tverberg does make the NHL, it feels like that's the type of player he's going to end up being. Steven, thanks for taking the time here in the summer to chat a little bit about Tverberg. Let the people know where we can find your work and plug anything else as well.
Yeah, so I just released my rankings of all 32
Yes.
NHL prospect pools. The Leafs are number can't tell you. That's a secret. You have to read it, but I'd say it is better than it was last year. And thank you to Easton Cowan for that, I would have to say. So I got that at dailyfaceoff.com. Going to be doing some Olympic qualification coverage over the next
Yes. Looking
few
forward to
days.
that.
Looking forward to that. And then yeah, prospect tournaments begin. My favorite time of the year. I know you love those, obviously, with all the
Oh,
the
yes.
content you put up. Like, man, the stuff you do in the development camp stuff is actually like nuts. Tracking all that stuff, but I love it. It's a good resource. But yeah, so I'll be doing a lot of that stuff. And my Twitter/X is Ellis Hockey.
Yeah, I gotta love it. This is the great time of the year for the hockey nerds that love the international hockey, and then we got the prospect stuff right afterwards. It's a nice 1-2 punch. Steven, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for jumping on.
You too.
Awesome. Thanks, man. This has been great. Enjoy the rest of your day. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks again to Steven for jumping on the show. Be sure to tune in tomorrow for more Camp Countdown. We'll see you then.